In the winter of 2001, a deafening mechanical roar that had defined American industrial might for over a century suddenly fell dead silent. Inside a sprawling 400,000 square foot fortress in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, the last massive lathes were permanently powered down. For decades, this facility was the beating heart of heavy industry. It forged the 14-foot steel gears that rotated the gun turrets of USS Navy battleships, synchronized the radar systems for NASA, and drove the monumental pumps of the Alaskan pipeline. Thousands of multi-generational machinists spent their lives breathing in the scent of cutting fluid and hot metal under one colossal roof. But today, that mighty empire of steel has been completely erased from the map. The factory was bulldozed and paved over. Where the world's most complex industrial machinery was once hammered into existence, modern consumers now wander through the quiet, brightly lit aisles of a Home Depot, buying cans of paint and wooden planks. How does a cornerstone of national defense, a company that helped build the arsenal of democracy, end up liquidating its greatest monument? They weren't destroyed by a foreign enemy or a sudden technological glitch. They were suffocated by their own massive scale. This is not just the story of Philadelphia gear. It is the autopsy of the American megafactory era, a time when titans of industry learned a brutal lesson. Sometimes, to keep a brand alive, you have to cut out your own heart. The story of American industrial supremacy does not begin in sterile boardrooms or on automated assembly lines. It begins in the soot-choked air of the late 19th century, amidst the deafening clatter of steam engines and the relentless national hunger for raw power. In 1892, the United States was a nation aggressively tearing itself away from its agrarian past, hurtling headlong into a mechanized future. At the center of this violent, smoky transformation was Pennsylvania, a state sitting atop massive, subterranean veins of anthracite coal. This coal was the black blood of the early Industrial Revolution, but extracting it from deep within the earth required machinery of unprecedented durability. It required continuous, reliable motion, and motion, at its core, required gears. Enter George B. Grant, a mechanical pioneer who understood a fundamental truth. A machine, no matter how massive or ambitious, is utterly useless if its power cannot be transmitted from the engine to the working parts. Grant did not want to build the steam engines. He wanted to build the vital organs that allowed those engines to do actual work. In a cramped, dimly lit machine shop in the heart of Philadelphia, he established Philadelphia Gear Works. The early days of their company were defined by brute force and meticulous, punishing craftsmanship. In the 1890s, gear cutting was not the precise, computer-guided science it is today. It was a physically demanding art form. Men with oil-stained hands and protective goggles wrestled heavy iron castings into rudimentary lathes, relying on keen eyes, steady hands, and instinct to cut perfect teeth into solid metal. The air inside the shop was a thick haze of smoke, sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of hot iron shavings. Their first major clients were the unforgiving anthracite coal mines that dotted the Pennsylvanian landscape. These mines operated in horrific conditions, damp, highly abrasive, and relentlessly demanding. The massive hoists that pulled men up from the black depths, the towering breakers that crushed raw coal into usable fuel, the heavy-duty water pumps that kept the subterranean shafts from flooding. All of them relied on heavy-duty gears. If a single gear stripped its teeth or shattered under pressure, production stopped entirely, and human lives were immediately put at risk. Grant's modest shop quickly earned a regional reputation for forging components that simply refused to break under the immense grinding strain of the mines. As the 20th century dawned, the national appetite for iron and early steel exploded. The rudimentary blast furnaces of Pennsylvania began to multiply, growing larger and significantly more complex. Philadelphia gear evolved organically alongside them. They transitioned from crafting small, rugged components for local coal operators to engineering much larger, heavier transmission systems for the steel mills themselves. They were no longer just a local vendor. They were actively becoming the mechanical connective tissue of the East Coast heavy industry. Then came 1914 and the eruption of the First World War. While the United States would not officially enter the bloody conflict until 1917, the war in Europe instantly transformed the American economy into a global supply engine. The demand for mechanized equipment, from transport vehicles to munitions manufacturing machinery, skyrocketed overnight. The cramped shop in Philadelphia found itself inundated with orders. The gears they were cutting were no longer just pulling coal from the ground. They were powering the machinery that would ultimately shape the outcome of a global conflict. This sudden, chaotic surge in wartime demand highlighted a critical flaw in the American manufacturing landscape: a severe lack of standardization. Every machine shop across the country had its own unique way of cutting a gear, its own acceptable tolerances, its own localized engineering language. Realizing that the national industry could not scale rapidly if every single component was a custom, isolated experiment, Philadelphia Gear took a pivotal leadership role. In 1916, alongside a handful of other forward-thinking manufacturers, they co-founded the American Gear Manufacturers Association, AGMA. This was a defining moment in the company's history. By helping to establish universal standards for gear design, manufacturing, and application, Philadelphia Gear transitioned from being merely a participant in the Industrial Revolution to being one of its primary architects. They were no longer just playing the game, they were writing the rules. As the roaring 20s approached and the ashes of the First World War settled, Philadelphia Gear had outgrown the small, soot-stained shop of George B. Grant's original vision. They had survived the crucible of early industrialism and emerged as a recognized, elite authority in mechanical power transmission. Yet, as they celebrated to their growing influence, they were entirely unaware of the storm that was gathering on the historical horizon. The modest successes of the early 20th century were merely a prelude. A second global conflict was brewing, one that would demand a scale of production previously thought impossible. The company was about to be thrust onto the national stage, tasked with arming a superpower. And in the process of answering that call, they would plant the seeds of an empire so massive, so heavy, that it would eventually crush them. As the 1930s drew to a close, the industrial drumbeat of another global conflict began to echo across the Atlantic. When the United States officially entered the Second World War in 1941, the nation was forced to undergo a rapid industrial mobilization unlike anything witnessed in human history. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called upon the country to become the arsenal of democracy, a sweeping mandate that transformed every functioning machine shop, auto plant, and steel mill into a vital organ of the Allied war effort. Philadelphia Gear was no longer just manufacturing power twists, transmission components for local coal mines and regional steel operators. Almost overnight, they were drafted to power the United States military machine. The demands placed on the company were staggering in both sheer volume and physical scale. Modern naval warfare required heavy steel armor and massive artillery, which in turn required unprecedented mechanical muscle to operate efficiently under fire. Inside the crowded, increasingly cramped confines of their urban Philadelphia plant, workers began forging colossal 14-foot steel gears, designed specifically to rotate the heavy gun turrets of U.S. Navy battleships. These were not mere mechanical parts. They were the literal lifelines of the Pacific and Atlantic fleets. The manufacturing process for gears of this magnitude was physically grueling and highly dangerous. It required pouring tons of molten steel, allowing it to cool into massive solid blanks, and then hoisting those blanks onto towering vertical lathes. Machinists stood for long, exhausting hours, bathed in the sharp scent of cutting oil, sulfur, and ozone, carefully monitoring the carving of each individual tooth. A single flaw in the metallurgical composition, or a fraction of a millimeter of deviation in the gear teeth, could mean a turret jamming in the heat of combat. Beyond the battleships, the company was tasked with engineering the complex propulsion drives for swift, agile destroyers. The factory floors operated in a state of relentless, 24-hour motion. A new generation of workers, including thousands of women who confidently stepped onto the heavy manufacturing floor as men deployed overseas, breathed the heavy, oil-saturated air, working under the intense, unforgiving pressure of wartime production quotas. The rhythmic roar of the lathes and the blinding heat of the foundry became the localized sound of a nation fighting for its very survival. During these crucible years, Philadelphia Gear perfected the art of extreme-scale manufacturing. They learned how to handle massive steel castings, how to cut enormous, interlocking teeth with critical precision, and how to deliver flawlessly under the heavy weight of national security. When the war finally ended in 1945, the company emerged not just victorious, but fundamentally transformed. They had tasted the power of massive, centralized production and proven they could deliver on a global scale. Yet, as peacetime returned and the post-war economic boom took hold, a new logistical crisis quietly emerged. They had simply outgrown their own walls. The deep, urban footprint that had birthed the company was now suffocating its future. By the late 1950s, the physical limitations of the original Philadelphia facilities were severely strangling the company's ability to take on larger, more ambitious peacetime contracts. The post-war era brought a massive surge in domestic infrastructure projects and the dawn of the Cold War aerospace race, all requiring heavier, more robust, and infinitely more complex transmission systems. To maintain their hard-won dominance on the national stage, the leadership of Philadelphia Gear realized that a radical physical expansion was not just a strategic option. It was a matter of corporate survival. They needed a facility that matched the colossal scale of their mid-century ambitions. In 1960, the company made a historic and irrevocable decision. They packed up their deep-rooted urban heritage and relocated to a sprawling stretch of land in King of Prussia, a rapidly developing suburb northwest of Philadelphia. Here, they did not just build a new factory. They constructed a veritable industrial fortress. The new facility was a monolithic 400,000-square-foot behemoth, an architectural testament to the era's unwavering belief in the absolute supremacy of centralized manufacturing. The philosophy behind the King of Prussia plant was simple but profoundly arrogant in its scale. Bring every single phase of heavy gear production under one singular, massive roof. From the initial pouring of molten metal in the roaring on-site foundry to the final precision cutting on the cavernous assembly floor, the entire life cycle of the world's largest mechanical components would happen within these four walls. When the heavy-duty overhead cranes, capable of lifting 50-ton steel castings as if they were toys, were installed, and the giant lathes were bolted securely to the reinforced concrete floors, Philadelphia Gear officially entered its golden age. Walking into the new plant was a sensory assault. The sheer volume of the space amplified the thunderous cacophony of metal being shaped by metal. It was a cathedral of heavy industry, a place where multi-generational machinists walked in with their heavy steel lunchboxes, fiercely proud to be part of an unstoppable American economic engine. The move successfully positioned the company to dominate the impending aerospace, naval, and energy booms of the coming decades. They were now capable of engineering mechanical solutions that smaller, decentralized shops wouldn't dare touch. However, buried deep beneath the thick concrete foundation of this newfound glory lay a dangerous economic reality. By concentrating their entire operational might into a single 400,000-square-foot footprint, the company had inadvertently lashed itself to an astronomical fixed overhead. The new factory was a hungry, unrelenting giant. To keep the massive bay lights on, the furnaces burning at optimum temperatures, and the thousands of specialized workers employed, the King of Prussia behemoth required a continuous, uninterrupted diet of massive, high-margin contracts. In 1960, the American economy was booming, global competition was minimal, and the giant was well-fed. But the leadership had inadvertently placed a ticking clock on their empire. They had bet their entire future on the assumption that the era of the centralized mega-factory would last forever, completely unaware of the economic storms already gathering on the horizon. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, the King of Prussia facility was not merely a manufacturing plant. It was an industrial sovereign state operating under a single, sprawling roof. Having successfully migrated from their cramped urban origins, Philadelphia Gear unleashed the full potential of its engineering prowess. The 400,000-square-foot fortress quickly evolved into a nerve center for global infrastructure, answering the call of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 20th century. If humanity was trying to push the boundaries of exploration, extraction, or defense, the King of Prussia behemoth was forging the mechanical muscle to make it happen. The sheer scale of operations within those walls defied ordinary comprehension. Walking the main assembly floor meant navigating a labyrinth of colossal machinery, where overhead bridge cranes glided silently through the high bays carrying steel castings that weighed tens of thousands of pounds. Below, massive battleship gear hobbing and grinding machines, some of the largest ever constructed in North America, carved with microscopic precision into solid metal. The concrete foundation of the building was specifically reinforced to absorb the relentless, deep-frequency vibrations of heavy cutting, turning the very floor of the factory into a living, vibrating entity. During this golden era, the company's portfolio expanded far beyond maritime defense. As the space race dominated the national consciousness, Philadelphia Gear secured highly classified and immensely complex contracts with NASA. The massive, slowly rotating satellite dishes of the Deep Space Network, which tracked the Apollo missions and communicated with probes venturing beyond our solar system, relied on elevation and azimuth gear drives engineered and cut inside the King of Prussia plant. These components required a paradoxical combination of traits. They were large enough to fill a room, yet demanded the precision of a Swiss watch to ensure a radar dish could track a spacecraft millions of miles away without a millimeter of drift. Simultaneously, the global hunger for energy brought the harshest environments on Earth to the factory's doorstep. When the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System was constructed to pump millions of barrels of crude oil across frozen, unforgiving tundra, the heavy-duty pump drives were manufactured here. These transmission systems had to be completely indestructible, designed to operate continuously in sub-zero temperatures where ordinary steel would become brittle and shatter. For the thousands of workers who clocked in across 3 continuous shifts, there was a profound, unspoken pride. The plant was a multi-generational ecosystem. Fathers trained sons on the massive vertical lathes. Veteran metallurgists passed down the intuitive knowledge of reading the color of hot steel to new apprentices. The King of Prussia behemoth was a symbol of absolute American industrial supremacy, radiating a sense of permanence and invincibility. They were building the machines that ran the world, and from the floor of the factory, it seemed as though the roaring momentum would never cease. Yet the very architecture of their monumental triumph concealed a fatal vulnerability. The King of Prussia facility was a marvel of centralized manufacturing, but it was also a captive beast with an insatiable appetite. By consolidating all of their engineering, foundry work, machining, and assembly into one colossal footprint, the leadership of Philadelphia Gear had inadvertently created an economic structure that could only survive under the condition of perpetual high-volume growth. The hidden danger lay in the agonizing mathematics of fixed overhead. A 400,000 square foot climate-controlled, heavily mechanized fortress requires an astronomical amount of capital just to exist. The industrial power grid required to keep the massive furnaces hot and the heavy machinery turning resulted in staggering monthly utility costs. The expansive property taxes, the continuous maintenance of the heavy lift cranes, and the payroll for thousands of highly specialized union workers meant that the company was bleeding a fortune every single day before a single piece of steel was ever shipped. To justify its own existence and simply break even, the behemoth had to be fed continuously. It required a steady, uninterrupted diet of massive, multi-million-dollar defense, aerospace, or infrastructure contracts. In the 1960s, during the peak of the Cold War and the domestic infrastructure boom, feeding the beast was easy. But as the factory settled into its operational rhythm, the inherent flaws of this rigid model began to surface. The megafactory lacked any semblance of agility because the overhead costs were so heavily distributed across the entire facility, taking on smaller, standard industrial orders. The very type of work that had initially built the company's foundation became mathematically impossible. A small gear order was swallowed whole by the massive hourly operating cost of the plant. They were forced to continually hunt for whales, the massive, high-margin projects, just to keep the lights on. Furthermore, if a massive machine capable of cutting a 20-foot gear sat idle for even a week while waiting for a contract to be finalized, it acted as a massive financial anchor, dragging down the profitability of the entire floor. The tension into the executive boardrooms grew quietly, contrasting sharply with the confident roar of the assembly lines below. The leadership realized they had lashed the survival of the entire brand to the assumption that the global market for ultra-heavy, centralized manufacturing would remain infinitely stable. They had built a fortress designed to withstand any mechanical strain, but they had not designed it to adapt. As the calendar turned toward the late 1970s, the economic climate of the United States was preparing to undergo a violent, unprecedented shift. The beast was hungry, its massive footprint was locked in place, and an icy wind was beginning to blow in from the American Rust Belt. For nearly 2 decades, the sprawling facility at King of Prussia operated under the assumption that the post-war American industrial boom was a permanent reality. But as the calendar turned to the late 1970s, the economic foundation of the United States began to fracture. A series of brutal macroeconomic shocks, fueled by the OPEC oil embargoes, soaring inflation, and deeply rooted labor disputes, sent tremors through the very industries that Philadelphia Gear relied upon to feed its massive manufacturing floor. The golden age of centralized, heavy American production was suddenly facing an existential crisis. The first major domino to fall was the American steel industry. For a century, the towering blast furnaces of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana had been the lifeblood of the nation's economy, and by extension, one of Philadelphia Gear's most reliable sources of revenue. The heavy transmission drives required to roll, press, and shape thousands of tons of raw steel were massive, highly profitable, and required constant maintenance and replacement. However, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, these domestic steel titans were collapsing under their own weight. Decades of complacency and a failure to modernize their equipment left American mills highly vulnerable to a new wave of globalized trade. Cheap, heavily subsidized, and efficiently produced steel from Japan and West Germany began flooding the United States market. The domestic mills simply could not compete on price. One by one, the legendary American blast furnaces went cold. Tens of thousands of steel workers were laid off, and entire manufacturing cities were plunged into economic ruin, giving birth to what would soon be known as the American Rust Belt. For Philadelphia Gear, the death of the American steel mill was not merely a tragic headline. It was a devastating blow to their supply chain ecosystem. When a massive steel plant in Pittsburgh or Bethlehem shut its doors, it did not just lay off its workforce. It instantly canceled all pending orders for replacement gears, heavy-duty gearboxes, and custom machining contracts. The massive, reliable whale contracts that the King of Prussia behemoth depended on to cover its astronomical overhead began to vanish. The globalization that killed American steel quickly spread to heavy machinery. Foreign competitors were no longer just exporting raw materials. They were exporting highly complex, precision-engineered mechanical components. International manufacturers, unburdened by the massive legacy costs and strict union contracts of older American firms, began undercutting domestic prices on heavy gear drives. They had rebuilt their factories from the ground up after the Second World War, utilizing the latest technologies, while American companies were often still relying on mid-century infrastructure. As the icy winds of deindustrialization swept across the Northeast, the atmosphere inside the King of Prussia plant fundamentally changed. The deafening, round-the-clock roar of the assembly floor began to experience terrifying moments of quiet. Massive horizontal boring mills and towering vertical lathes, machines that cost thousands of dollars a day just to maintain and power, began to sit idle for weeks at a time. The fortress they had built to conquer the world was suddenly standing on shifting ground. While international globalization was tearing away at the top tier of their heavy industry contracts, a quiet technological revolution was eroding the company's foundation from the bottom up. The 1980s saw the rapid commercialization and widespread adoption of computer numerical control, CNC machining. This technology fundamentally altered the landscape of manufacturing by allowing cutting tools to be operated by programmed software rather than by manual labor. Before CNC, precision gear cutting was an art form that relied heavily on the on the physical intuition and decades of experience of master machinists. It required massive, rigid, and incredibly expensive machinery to ensure the cuts were accurate. The King of Prussia plant was filled with these legendary artisans and the monumental machines they operated. However, CNC technology democratized precision. Suddenly, small, decentralized machine shops operating out of modest industrial parks could produce highly accurate, standardized gears at a fraction of the cost. These nimble, non-unionized competitors did not have to worry about powering a 400,000 square foot facility, heating a massive on-site foundry, or maintaining an army of middle managers. Their overhead was virtually non-existent compared to the industrial sovereign state of Philadelphia gear. This created a brutal paradox for the executives navigating the crisis. If a customer needed a standard, medium-sized gear drive, the small, agile CNC shops could deliver it faster and dramatically cheaper. The King of Prussia plant could not lower its prices to match the competition without taking a massive financial loss, because the fixed cost of simply turning the lights on inside their behemoth factory had to be factored into every single invoice. Philadelphia gear was effectively boxed out of the high-volume, standard-order market. They became entirely dependent on ultra-heavy custom engineering, the massive specialized projects that the small CNC shops physically could not handle. They were forced to survive exclusively on the fringes of extreme manufacturing, massive naval contracts, colossal mining equipment, and specialized infrastructure. But even those markets were shrinking. The end of the Cold War and the shifting priorities of federal spending meant that military and aerospace contracts were becoming fiercely competitive and less frequent. The behemoth at King of Prussia was starving. It was built for an era of brute force and massive scale. But the new world demanded agility, extreme cost efficiency, and digital precision. The very scale that had once been their greatest competitive advantage had transformed into a fatal liability. The fortress had become a prison. Inside the executive suites, far above the echoing quiet of the partially idle factory floor, the financial realities were becoming impossible to ignore. The balance sheets were bleeding, and a terrifying realization began to take hold. The giant could not survive the changing climate unless it fundamentally changed its anatomy. The stage was set for a desperate internal war for survival. Inside the King of Prussia facility, the atmosphere began to shift from one of unshakable industrial pride to a quiet, pervasive anxiety. A 400,000 square foot megafactory is not a passive structure. It is a living, breathing organism with a terrifyingly high metabolic rate. Even when the massive assembly floor was entirely quiet, the building consumed capital at a staggering pace. This was the brutal, inescapable mathematics of extreme fixed overhead, and as the 1990s progressed, it was slowly and methodically suffocating Philadelphia gear. To truly comprehend this internal crisis, one must understand the sheer physical cost of maintaining a centralized industrial fortress. The utility bills alone were astronomical. Heating and illuminating an uninsulated cavernous space with ceilings high enough to accommodate 50-ton bridge cranes required a fortune in industrial energy. The massive electrical grids necessary to power the heavy-duty gear-hobbing machines, the deep-frequency grinders, and the on-site metallurgical furnaces had to be maintained, regardless of whether they were cutting steel for a multi-million-dollar naval contract or sitting completely idle. The power meters spun relentlessly, burning through cash while the order books grew thinner. Beyond the utilities lay the crushing weight of structural maintenance and property taxes. The overhead cranes, which were the literal lifelines of the factory floor, required rigorous, highly expensive safety inspections and continuous mechanical upkeep. The reinforced concrete floors, the heavy bay doors, the specialized cutting fluid disposal systems. Every square inch of the King of Prussia plant demanded constant financial feeding. Furthermore, the company was bound to a massive, rigid payroll. The workforce was composed of highly specialized, multi-generational artisans and union laborers whose wages, pensions, and legacy benefits had been negotiated and locked in during a golden era of uninterrupted prosperity. In previous decades, these massive operating costs were easily absorbed by the sheer volume and high margins of government defense contracts and colossal infrastructure projects. The overhead was simply a fraction of a massive invoice. But as the external market dried up and the era of the Rust Belt solidified, that financial cushion evaporated completely. The executives in the accounting department began to stare at ledgers that flashed bright red month after month. A terrifying metric known as the burn rate began to dominate closed-door meetings. It calculated exactly how much money the facility was losing every single day it did not operate at absolute maximum capacity. When a giant vertical lathe sat idle for a week, it wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a massive financial anchor dragging down the profitability of the entire corporation. The men and women on the factory floor, who had spent decades taking immense pride in their craftsmanship, could feel the tension bleeding down from the executive suites. They noticed the increasingly longer gaps between raw material deliveries. They saw the giant steel blanks sitting untouched in the staging areas, gathering a thin layer of dust. The roaring heartbeat of the behemoth was skipping, and the silence between the beats was deafening. As the financial hemorrhage worsened, a desperate internal war for survival erupted within the boardroom. The leadership of Philadelphia Gear was paralyzed by a profound psychological and strategic conflict. For over 3 decades, the King of Prussia facility had been the undisputed crown jewel of their empire. It was the physical manifestation of their dominance, a monumental testament to the belief that absolute scale equated to absolute power. Admitting that this colossal investment was now actively killing them required a complete, humiliating dismantling of their corporate identity. Initially, the executive strategy was deeply rooted in denial. Management frantically attempted to adapt to the changing market by aggressively bidding on smaller, standard industrial contracts, the very jobs that agile, decentralized CNC machine shops were now dominating. But this strategy quickly collapsed under the weight of their own infrastructure. The accounting department presented a grim mathematical reality. They physically could not lower their prices to be competitive, because the massive overhead of the 400,000 square foot plant had to be factored into every single operational hour. Even the simplest, smallest gear order became catastrophically expensive to produce. The factory was practically incapable of doing anything small. It was a sledgehammer trying to perform the work of a scalpel. The boardroom heavily divided into factions. Some veteran executives, deeply and emotionally attached to the legacy of the mega factory, fiercely argued for weathering the storm. They clung to the desperate hope of a miraculous turnaround, a new massive naval buildup, a sudden resurgence in domestic heavy manufacturing, or a government intervention that would magically feed the hungry giant once again. They viewed the King of Prussia plant not just as a factory, but as a sacred monument to American industrial supremacy that had to be protected at all costs. But a new faction of leadership, staring at the unforgiving, bleeding reality of the balance sheets, understood that the era of centralized or heavy manufacturing in America was dead. They recognized the fatal misstep of their predecessors, tying the survival of an entire national brand to a single, inflexible footprint. The modern global economy now demanded speed, extreme cost efficiency, and regional decentralization. The giant could no longer survive by sheer brute force. It was during the during these agonizing months of debate, that a horrific realization firmly took root. The fortress had become a tomb, the only way to save Philadelphia Gear as a functioning corporate entity, to protect its invaluable intellectual property, its engineering legacy, and its century-old brand name, was to completely abandon the all-under-one-roof philosophy. They would have to transition into a decentralized business model, utilizing smaller, strategically located regional service centers rather than one massive, cash-burning manufacturing hub. This strategic pivot meant one inescapable, heartbreaking thing. The mighty King of Prussia behemoth had to be sacrificed. The leadership finally accepted that to keep the head of the company alive, they had to deliberately cut out its massive, beating heart. The decision was not made out of malice or sudden greed, but out of cold, mathematical survival. The giant had finally collapsed under its own immense weight, and the execution order for the greatest factory they had ever built was quietly, officially drafted. By the late 1990s, the fierce ideological battles within the executive suites of Philadelphia Gear had exhausted themselves, replaced by the cold, undeniable gravity of arithmetic. The financial modeling was complete, and the verdict was absolute. The centralized mega-factory model was no longer mathematically viable. The 400,000 square foot King of Prussia facility, once hailed as a triumph of American industrial engineering and a cornerstone of national defense, had officially been classified as an unsustainable liability. The corporate restructuring plan that emerged from these grueling closed-door sessions was brutal in its pragmatism. To save the century-old brand from total bankruptcy, the company had to fundamentally reinvent its operational anatomy. The new strategy demanded an asset-light approach. Instead of attempting to manufacture every single component from scratch under one massive, cash-burning roof, Philadelphia Gear would pivot to a decentralized network. They would establish smaller, highly agile regional service centers strategically situated near critical customer bases, such as the oil fields of Texas, the mining operations of the Midwest, and the commercial marine hubs of the coast. These Resiri regional centers would focus almost entirely on rapid repair, final assembly, and specialized on-site engineering. The heavy foundational casting and the initial brute force cutting work that had once been the company's proudest hallmark would be outsourced to specialized, lower-cost global supply chains. It was a brilliant, necessary survival strategy for the modern era, but it carried a devastating prerequisite. Implementing this decentralized, agile model meant that the King of Prussia behemoth had to be systematically dismantled. There was simply no room for a massive, capital-intensive foundry in a nimble, decentralized future. For the veteran leadership team, finalizing this decision felt akin to signing a death warrant for a beloved patriarch. The men who sat around the mahogany boardroom tables had built their entire careers on the prestige of this facility. For decades, they had confidently escorted military generals, aerospace engineers, and foreign dignitaries onto the massive assembly floor to showcase the sheer, intimidating muscle of American manufacturing. Now, they were legally bound to destroy it. The formal boardroom surrender was entirely devoid of ceremony. It was executed quietly through dry legal documents, severance negotiations, and phased liquidation schedules. They were not just making a real estate decision to close a factory. They were actively choosing to sever the company's physical connection to its own glorious history. The heart of the empire was to be cut out so the remaining limbs could survive. With the final executive signatures secured and the corporate transition officially initiated, the heavy, suffocating burden of the truth began its slow, devastating descent from the quiet, carpeted offices down to the oil-stained concrete of the factory floor. When the official announcement finally breached the walls of the manufacturing floor, it did not arrive with a dramatic flourish or a sudden alarm. It came in the form of sterile corporate memos pinned to bulletin boards, mandatory all-hands meetings led by somber executives, and the sudden, ominous presence of third-party liquidation consultants walking the aisles with clipboards and appraisal sheets. The mandate delivered to the workforce was clear and irreversible. King of Prussia was to be entirely phased out. The production lines would be systematically wound down, the heavy machinery sold for scrap or global auction, and the vast majority of the workforce would be permanently laid off. The immediate reaction among the thousands of highly skilled machinists, welders, and foundry workers was not violent outrage, but a profound, paralyzing shock. For generations, employment at the King of Prussia plant had been viewed as an unbreakable covenant. A job here was not merely a paycheck, it was a secure, lifelong identity. Fathers had spent decades training their sons on the colossal vertical lathes. Families had built their entire economic foundations, bought homes, and planned retirements on the deeply ingrained assumption that as long as the United States needed heavy infrastructure, the furnaces of Philadelphia gear would keep burning. As the reality of the stipple of the impending shutdown set in, the psychological atmosphere inside the the 400,000 square foot fortress grew toxic with a mixture of grief and profound betrayal. The workers were forced to swallow a bitter pill. They were not losing their jobs because they had failed to produce quality work, or because the massive gear drives they built were mechanically flawed. They were losing their livelihoods because the rules of the global economy had been completely rewritten while they were busy working, and their massive, magnificent factory simply didn't fit on the new economic map. In the weeks following the announcement, the rhythm of the plant changed dramatically. The roaring, 24-hour heartbeat of production was replaced by the grim, methodical cadence of a death watch. Men who had spent 30 years carefully calibrating micrometers to cut perfect steel teeth now found themselves walking past machines bearing bright red auction tags. The deep camaraderie that had defined the shift work fractured under the heavy weight of uncertain futures. Workers stood by their partially idle machines, staring up at the massive overhead cranes that would soon be dismantled, realizing with a sinking dread that their highly specialized skills, honed to perfection over decades, were virtually useless in a modern economy dominated by service sectors and retail. The boardroom had successfully secured the survival of the corporate entity on paper, but down on the factory floor, an entire industrial culture was collapsing in real time. The men and women of King of Prussia were forced to confront a terrifying truth. They were the last generation of a dying breed, standing inside a monument that was about to be erased from the earth. The year 2001 arrived at the King of Prussia facility not with the familiar, earth-shaking roar of heavy industry, but with a creeping terminal silence. The corporate mandate that had been signed in the sterile, quiet boardrooms was now executing its grim reality down onto the oil-stained concrete of the factory floor. The sprawling 400,000-square-foot fortress, once a chaotic and triumphant symphony of grinding metal, hissing steam, and deep-frequency vibration, was being methodically and ruthlessly dismantled. The transition from an active world-class manufacturing hub to an industrial graveyard had officially begun. The winding-down process was not a sudden, dramatic event, but rather a slow, agonizing bleed. It was the humiliating spectacle for the veteran workforce who were forced to witness the physical unmaking of their life's work. Across the cavernous assembly bays, the monumental machinery that had shaped the 20th century was systematically powered down. The massive vertical lathes, the deep-hole borers, and the heavy-duty gear-hobbing machines, engineering marvels that had once cut the steel for aircraft carriers and space-tracking radar systems, were wiped clean of their cutting fluids and slapped with bright red fluorescent auction tags. A cruel irony settled over the remaining workforce. Instead of building the future of American infrastructure, a small retained skeleton crew was assigned the heartbreaking task of cannibalizing their own livelihood. Men who had spent 30 years carefully calibrating these colossal machines to microscopic tolerances were now handed heavy wrenches and blowtorches, instructed to unbolt the iron giants from the reinforced concrete foundations. They spent their final weeks draining thousands of gallons of industrial lubricants, severing heavy electrical conduits, and preparing the equipment for international shipping. The emotional toll inside the facility was suffocating. The factory floor was frequently toured by third-party liquidation agents and foreign manufacturing executives, men in pristine suits, walking with clipboards, inspecting the dismantled machinery for purchase. They were buying the mechanical muscle of Philadelphia gear for pennies on the dollar, preparing to ship the heavy lathes overseas to the very competitors who had undercut the American market. For the generational workers who had poured their blood, sweat, and youth into the King of Prussia plant, watching their beloved machinery being cataloged as cheap scrap was a profound psychological violation. As the weeks dragged on, the physical environment of the behemoth began to change drastically. Without the ambient heat generated by the massive metallurgical furnaces and the friction of continuous machining, the cavernous building grew bitterly cold. The thick haze of sulfur, hot iron, and ozone that had permanently hung in the rafters for decades slowly dissipated, replaced by the sterile, dusty scent of undisturbed concrete. The towering overhead bridge cranes, which had once glided constantly back and forth carrying 50-ton steel castings, sat parked at the far ends of the bays, completely motionless. The factory was hollowed out from the inside, a dying giant taking its final rattling breaths. When the absolute final day of operations arrived in the late autumn of 2001, there was no grand ceremony, no local news cameras, and no speeches from the executive suites. The death of the King of Prussia megafactory was an intimately quiet, deeply private tragedy, shared only by the men and women who had stayed. Until the bitter end. The final shift began with a chilling milestone, the permanent extinguishing of the on-site foundry fires. For over 40 years, these massive metallurgical furnaces had burned with a fierce, blinding intensity, melting down raw iron and steel to forge the indestructible blanks that fed the entire facility. They were the literal beating heart of the 400,000 square foot plant, radiating a localized heat that could be felt across the assembly floor. When the main gas lines were finally valved off and the safety systems were engaged, the flames flickered and died. The thick, heavy steel doors of the kilns were left open to cool, plunging the foundry into a dark, cold state it had never experienced since the day the building was constructed. Down on the main floor, the few remaining machinists completed their final tasks. They wiped the grease from their from their hands with shop rags for the very last time, meticulously cleaned their micrometers and calipers, and placed them into heavy metal toolboxes. These toolboxes were deeply personal artifacts covered in decades of scratches, faded union stickers, and oil stains. They held the accumulated tools of a lifetime of specialized labor. The sound of hundreds of metal latches clicking shut echoed through the vast, empty bays, a somber drumbeat signaling the end of an era. The walk from the locker rooms to the main exit was a grueling psychological marathon. The workers carried their heavy toolboxes down the long, central aisle of the factory, passing the hollowed-out concrete pits where the giant lathes had once stood. They walked past the empty staging areas, the dismantled inspection rooms, and the darkened supervisor offices. Fathers who had brought their sons into the trade walked shoulder to shoulder with them toward the glass doors, carrying the heavy realization that the skills they possessed were now effectively obsolete. As the last worker stepped out into the harsh daylight of the parking lot, the facility manager walked over to the primary industrial breaker panels. With a series of heavy, echoing clicks, the massive electrical grids that had powered the behemoth were violently severed from the municipal power supply. The high-bay sodium lights buzzed loudly for a fraction of a second before plunging the 400,000 square foot interior into total, unforgiving darkness. The silence that instantly swallowed the King of Prussia plant was absolute and terrifying. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, unnatural void where a 95-decibel roar of American pride used to live. The mighty fortress had officially been surrendered, leaving behind only the ghosts of the machines and the devastating reality of a workforce left behind by the merciless march of time. The absolute silence that swallowed the King of Prussia megafactory in the winter of 2001 was profoundly unnatural, but it was also brief. Within months, a new mechanical symphony arrived on the sprawling suburban campus. Though this one was not geared toward creation, it was the frantic, tearing rhythm of demolition. The 400,000 square foot industrial fortress, explicitly engineered to withstand the brutal, deep-frequency vibrations of heavy metal machining, proved stubbornly resistant to its own execution. The reinforced concrete foundations and heavy steel pillars did not yield easily to the wrecking crews, a final, defiant stand from a building that had been constructed with the arrogant assumption of permanence. Witnessing the physical deconstruction of the plant was a surreal experience for the local community. The towering overhead cranes, which had once delicately manipulated steel components weighing tens of thousands of pounds, were unceremoniously cut apart by acetylene torches and allowed to crash onto the very assembly floors they had once serviced. The massive subterranean pits that had housed the deep-hole borers and vertical lathes were unceremoniously filled with pulverized brick and dirt. The on-site foundry, the fiercely beating, blistering heart of the facility that had radiated heat for over 4 decades, was reduced to a mountain of shattered masonry and tangled rebar. In a matter of weeks, a century of accumulated industrial capability was aggressively scrubbed from the surface of the earth. This rapid erasure was driven by a ruthless new economic reality. When Philadelphia gear originally migrated to King of Prussia in 1960, the area was a quiet, expansive suburb with plenty of cheap land suitable for heavy manufacturing. But by the early 2000s, the geographic and economic landscape of the region had radically transformed. The surrounding area had evolved into one of the most lucrative commercial and retail hubs on the American East Coast, anchored by the massive King of Prussia Mall. The sprawling acreage beneath the dying megafactory was no longer valued for its industrial zoning or its proximity to rail lines. It was prized exclusively for its commercial real estate potential. The brutal mathematics of the modern economy dictated that the land was infinitely more profitable as a platform for consumer retail than it could ever be as a center for heavy manufacturing. The era of producing capital goods, the heavy machines required to build other machines, had been officially usurped by the era of mass consumption. Once the site was scraped down to the bedrock and the last trucks of industrial debris were hauled away, the rebuilding process commenced with dizzying speed. However, the architecture of the new era stood in stark, almost insulting contrast to what had preceded it. The original gear plant was a heavy, fortified monolith built to endure the punishing extremes of molten steel and extreme mechanical torque. The structure that rapidly took its place was a lightweight, prefabricated steel shell, a sprawling Home Depot big box store. It was architecture designed not for generational endurance, but for rapid assembly, maximum floor space, and immediate commercial turnover. Today, the transformation is so absolute that it borders on the ghostly. The site where the United States forged the mechanical muscle for its global supremacy is now a monument to domestic DIY projects and suburban convenience. A profound, almost tragic dissonance haunts the physical space. Modern consumers pull their cars into a vast, smoothly paved parking lot, completely unaware that their tires are resting directly above the buried foundations of the old metallurgical foundry. Inside the brightly lit, climate-controlled aisles of the retail store, the sensory environment has been entirely rewritten. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of sulfur, ozone, and smoking cutting oil has been replaced by the sterile, manufactured scents of cut pine lumber, chemical fertilizers, and latex paint. The bone-rattling 95-decibel roar of heavy industrial lathes shaping solid iron has been swapped for the soft, ambient hum of fluorescent lighting. The cheerful beeping of barcode scanners at the checkout registers, and the quiet shuffle of shopping carts. There is no plaque in the parking lot. There is no monument in the lumber aisle to honor the multi-generational machinists who spent their entire lives under that specific patch of sky, breathing in heavy manufacturing dust to build the infrastructure of the 20th century. The erasure is absolute. The shoppers who wander the aisles looking for discounted power tools and garden hoses are walking directly through to the airspace where 50-ton steel castings once floated on overhead cranes. This is the ultimate physical aftermath of the American Rust Belt trajectory. The collapse of the King of Prussia behemoth did not just result in a loss of jobs or a shift in corporate strategy. It fundamentally transformed the very nature of the ground it stood on. The nation ceased to be a place that made the things that ran the world and quietly settled into being a place that merely bought them. The most haunting aspect of the King of Prussia collapse is not that the company died, but that it actually survived. If you were to search for Philadelphia gear today, you would not find an obituary. You would find an active, operating enterprise. In 2011, the brand was acquired by the Timken Company, a global manufacturer of bearings and power transmission products. Today, Philadelphia Gear continues to provide critical mechanical components to the United States military, commercial marine fleets, and global energy sectors. By all standard metrics of corporate finance, the agonizing boardroom decisions of the late 1990s were an absolute success. The desperate, radical surgery worked. The executives successfully saved the brand by surgically cutting out its massive, beating heart. Today, the company operates exactly as the restructuring plan dictated, through a decentralized network of regional service and manufacturing centers scattered across the country. These modern facilities in places like Houston, Chicago, and Los Angeles are incredibly efficient, immaculately clean, and highly profitable. They are nimble, asset-light operations heavily reliant on global supply chains, digital logistics, and advanced CNC automation. They represent the absolute pinnacle of modern, lean manufacturing. Yet to the veteran machinists who once walked the floors of the 400,000 square foot behemoth in Pennsylvania, this modern iteration is nothing more than a corporate phantom. The name on the letterhead is identical, but the soul of the enterprise has been permanently excised. There is a profound generational disconnect between the company that exists today and the empire that built it. The modern workforce of engineers and technicians operates in climate-controlled environments, analyzing digital CAD models and coordinating with overseas foundries. They are highly skilled, but they will never intuitively understand the visceral, bone-rattling reality of the mother plant. They will never know what it feels like to stand 30 feet away from an open metallurgical furnace, feeling the blistering heat of molten steel on their faces. They will never breathe air thick with the scent of ozone and sulfur. Nor will they feel the concrete floor vibrate under the immense torque of a 50-ton steel casting being carved by a 3-story vertical lathe. That specific breed of industrial knowledge, the kind that was passed down from father to son, relying on the sound of a cutting tool or the exact color of hot iron, is extinct. It has been replaced by the quiet hum of computer processors and the sterile efficiency of automated production. The ghost in the machine has finally been exorcised. This tragedy extends far beyond a single company. The story of Philadelphia Gear is the ultimate reflection of the American industrial paradox. The United States spent the first half of the 20th century building monuments to its own manufacturing supremacy. The belief was that sheer scale, brute force, and centralization were the ultimate weapons of economic dominance. The megafactories were designed to be permanent, indestructible fortresses. But as the global economy shifted, those fortresses became prisons. The very traits that made American heavy industry so powerful, its massive scale and deep generational roots, ultimately made it too slow, too expensive, and too rigid to survive the dawn of the 21st century. The brutal lesson of the Rust Belt is that the modern economy does not reward permanence. It rewards agility. To survive the modern era, you cannot be a giant. You must be a ghost. As the sun sets over the crowded parking lot of the Home Depot that now occupies the King of Prussia site, thousands of cars roll smoothly over the buried foundations of the old foundry. The shoppers inside are completely oblivious to the industrial empire that once roared exactly where they are standing. They do not know about the 14-foot battleship gears, the deep space radar drives, or the generations of men and women who gave their youth to the roaring machines. The physical legacy has been erased, but the historical weight remains. We traded the deafening roar of creation for the quiet convenience of consumption. The machines are gone, the giant is dead, and all that is left is the silence of an era that will never return. The story of Philadelphia Gear's King of Prussia facility is more than just a footnote in the history of American manufacturing. It is a profound, somewhat tragic reflection of a radical global economic shift. For over a century, the United States built its supremacy on the absolute foundation of sheer scale. The prevailing belief was that the bigger the factory, the thicker the concrete, and the heavier the machinery, the more untouchable the empire would be. We built monuments to permanence, pouring our youth, our sweat, and our national pride into colossal structures designed to last forever. But the 21st century ruthlessly rewrote the rules of survival. It taught us a brutal, unforgiving lesson. In a hyper-connected, globalized world, scale is no longer a shield. It is a target. The very weight that made these industrial giants so powerful ultimately anchored them to the bottom of a rapidly shifting economic sea. To survive, modern corporations had to learn how to sever their own deep roots. They had to abandon the roaring, soot-stained cathedrals of heavy industry and embrace the quiet, sterile efficiency of decentralization. Today, as consumers wander the brightly lit aisles of the retail stores that sit directly atop these buried foundries, we are left to wonder about the true cost of this transition. We have undoubtedly gained cheaper goods, infinite convenience, and a cleaner environment. But we have lost something vital in the exchange. We lost the visceral, roaring heartbeat of creation. We lost the multi-generational pride of building the massive, heavy machines that physically shape the modern world. The King of Prussia megafactory may be gone, but its ghost still lingers beneath the smooth asphalt of our modern consumer lives. It stands as a silent reminder that every era of modern convenience is built upon the forgotten graves of heavy industry. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into our industrial history compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What happened to the great manufacturing plants in your own hometown? Let's keep the history of these forgotten empires alive.